Thanks. Thank you all for coming here this evening. I'm surprised to see quite so many people. It's a little unnerving to speak to people in real life. I'm used to speaking to the laptop, and of course it has the advantage that it can't contradict me. People can't shout back at me through the laptop. So if anyone wants to say anything, do feel free to do so. It's a little bit... Traditional Britain is an interesting idea because as we get older, and I can see there's a few people here that are probably as old as I am, we do rather tend to look at the past with rose-tinted spectacles. We tend to think everything was better in the old days. Something that young people don't quite get. I remember in the 1960s, my grandparents, who grew up under Queen Victoria's reign, they asserted to me quite sincerely that the rot set in 1914. As far as they were concerned, everything after 1914 was a disaster, and that the world genuinely was much better in the Edwardian era than it was in the 1960s, which is absurd. I feel myself in the same position now, because I look back on the 70s and I think, well, it's absolutely great. It was so wonderful then, and it's so awful now. So we have to be careful to guard against that, against sort of being against the modern world, simply because it's unfamiliar to us and it doesn't tie in with our own memories and so on. Ecclesiastes, I don't know if anybody here reads the Bible, Ecclesiastes said, never ask why things were so much better in the old days. It's not an intelligent question. And that was 2,500 years ago. So it's something worth remembering, that although, like me, you're probably all very nostalgic for what you believe to be traditional Britain, our memories do play us false sometimes, and we do tend to remember only the good parts about the past. I want to talk this evening a little bit about some of the changes that we've seen, and particularly about a change in perspective which is very noticeable over the last 50 or 60 years. And I want to think particularly about colonialism, the British Empire and slavery. I know when I was growing up, I know in the 50s and 60s, I wasn't as enthusiastic about the British Empire, obviously, as my grandparents' generation were. It was just one of those things. I learned about it at school, but I certainly wasn't ashamed of it. I might not have been a jingoist and a sort of raving patriot, but when I learned about all the things that the British Empire had done for the world, and how we had civilised Africa and large parts of Asia, I knew that it was a good thing. I might not have been a flag waver in the 60s, but I knew that it was a fairly good thing that happened. That perspective has shifted dramatically now. The British Empire now is something that we all have to be ashamed of. It's something that we're not really to acknowledge that any good came from it at all. And I want to talk a bit about that, and also the ill effects that mental state has had upon the country, because it's not just a bit of harmless nonsense. When I hear young people talking about how bad the British Empire was, it's not just something that I can smile and say to myself, oh, they're young, they'll learn. It actually has ill effects upon the nation as we see it today. So in school, we all learned about the empire, obviously. That's what we did when I was at school. The idea that we should be ashamed of it comes from a thing called white privilege, and I'm sure you've all heard of that. Yeah. It's a concept from critical race theory. And the idea is that because of the empire, because of the advantages it supposedly gave to the white people in Britain, we should somehow feel ashamed. It's something we should hang our head when we hear about the empire. And that explains a lot of what we see. You probably all noticed that when you see advertisements now, 9 times out of 10 it's nearly all black people. And the same thing with television dramas and even stuff set in the past. Yes, everywhere you look. And it's a bit weird. You know, we ask ourselves why. The answer is because the people making those things feel ashamed. They feel that they owe a debt to black people. They've been persuaded that they have to do something to give black people a leg up, and that it's almost an ethical or a moral duty to do so. And that results in some very bizarre things. I expect you've all seen historical dramas set in, say, Tudor England, and suddenly you realise that half the people are black, which is really weird. But what's awful is if you remark upon it, I remarked upon this once to my daughter, who's very intelligent and she's young, and she looked at me as though I hadn't been using a deodorant. And the reason was that it's considered ill-mannered even to notice that sort of manipulation of history. You're not only supposed to applaud it, you're supposed to take it for granted and not ask, why is this happening? And again, I find that slightly odd, to say the least of it. The assumption is based upon two things. The assumption that we should feel bad. Firstly, there's the slave trade. And when I say the slave trade, you all know at once that I'm talking of the transatlantic slave trade. That's what people, automatically, it's like Pavlovian response. The slave trade, aha, that's black people in ships being taken across the Atlantic. If you see a book in the library or in the bookshop about the slave trade, it's the transatlantic slave trade. It's about black people being mistreated by us, mistreated by the British and by other Europeans. But there's something very weird about that, because slavery has been around for thousands and thousands of years. The first written reference we have to slavery dates back 4,000 years to Mesopotamia, which is a bill of sale for some slaves and some domestic farm animals. So chattel slavery is nothing new. Most of us, when we were young, learned about slavery not in the context of the transatlantic slave trade, but in biblical context. We know that the children of Israel were slaves in Egypt. We learn the story of Joseph being sold into slavery. We didn't think anything, I certainly didn't really think about the transatlantic slave trade when I was growing up as a child. It wasn't even on my horizon in those days. I knew about slavery and I knew it had always been around. So that's one way in which our perspective has shifted somehow. There's also a little story that every school child used to know, and that's the story of Pope Gregory seeing some beautiful slaves in the market in Rome in the 6th century. And it's one of those little things that would appear in every history book, and it's of interest to me because it's how Englishness first came to be defined. What the story is that Pope Gregory was walking through the marketplace, the slave market in Rome in the 6th century AD, and he saw some beautiful children, and he asked the seller who these children were, who are they? And the seller told him they were English people, that they were Angli. And Pope Gregory made a very clever pun in Latin. He said non-Angli, said Angeli, not English people, but angels. And that story is related by the Venerable Bede. Some of you might have heard of him. I know this is stuff that we learned at school and everyone's forgotten now. The Venerable Bede was an ecclesiastical historian in Anglo-Saxon England, and he tells that story, and it's the first time in writing that English people have been mentioned, that the idea of Englishness and English people and English race ever appeared. And as I say, it was in connection with slavery. So slavery is as much part of the English idea as it is of any Caribbean or any African American. It's absurd for the black people to take to themselves the idea that slavery is some unique thing that they have. It's not. English people, our very concept of Englishness began with the idea of slavery, with that little anecdote about Pope Gregory. I mention this, obviously, because, well, I'll give another example. We all remember the disgraceful scenes in Bristol in 2020 when Edward Colston's statue was pulled down. And we were all aware that Bristol was a slave trading port, and it was a very terrible thing, and we all hung our heads and felt guilty. This was when the Black Matter disturbances were taking place. The interesting thing is, though, not any of those people taking part in those disorders had the faintest idea that Bristol had been a slave trading port 500 years, 600 years before the transatlantic slave trade. Slaves were exported from Bristol to Ireland by the Vikings Bristol was already a slave trading port at that time in the Saxon period. The Vikings set up the Irish cities, Dublin, Limerick and Waterford, were all Viking slave trading settlements originally. They used to export English slaves from Bristol, they'd take them to Dublin, and then they'd be sold to international traders, among them people from North Africa. So English slaves were being taken away to Africa centuries before the transatlantic slave trade, when Africans were being taken across the Atlantic, which is something quite curious to think of. As late as 1086, when the Domesday Book was being compiled, it was discovered that 10% of the people in England were actually slaves, not serfs, actual slaves. They belonged to somebody else. As English people, we have every right to feel as strongly about slavery and the slave trade as anybody from Jamaica or any African American. They've somehow managed to get it so that slavery and the slave trade is their exclusive property, their own particular grudge. It's nonsense. For a lot of black people, that's actually part of their identity, as we know. The other thing that I want to talk about briefly is the Industrial Revolution, because these things tie in together. The Industrial Revolution and the transatlantic slave trade are now tied together, and they're both a way of making us feel guilty. They're both a way of making us feel that we've done something bad. When I was at school, we learned about the Industrial Revolution. It was a great thing. It was a good thing. We learned about how the first steam engines, mechanisation of factories and so on. It all began in this country, and then we exported it to the world. We civilised the world. The things that happened during that Industrial Revolution are what made the world the thing it is now. But now it's suggested that we should feel guilty about the Industrial Revolution, just as we should feel guilty about the slave trade. And those two things tie in together in this way. It's not just that during the slave trade some rich people made a lot of money out of slavery. If that were the case, then we could probably evade the feeling of guilt, the collective guilt of our ancestry. The story now is as follows. During the Industrial Revolution, we all learned about the spinning jenny at school and Arkwright, and I see some awfully blank faces. I hope everyone hasn't forgotten what they were taught about with spinning jenny and how factories became mechanised. Those factories, of course, relied upon cotton. A lot of them, the textile mills in the north, needed a supply of cotton. The cotton was produced by slaves in America. So straight away there's a connection there. The prosperity of this country from the Industrial Revolution onward is founded, allegedly, on cotton produced by slaves. In the same way, sugar became cheap at about that time, so it wasn't just rich people that have sugar in their tea, it was ordinary people. Where did the sugar come from? It came from the slave plantations. These are two things which suggest, or for the gullible, they make it seem that our modern society, all the riches and the wealth that we have, was founded ultimately upon slavery. This also ties in with a very modern idea, which is about climate change, because the other thing that is being said now is that the Industrial Revolution was the start of global warming. No, seriously, and that we are guilty. It's one more thing that England did that was a bad thing. We started building factories. We used to be proud of James Watt and his steam engine, but the steam engines ran on coal, which polluted the atmosphere, and that's where the climate change came from. And this is now... I know, you may well laugh. It sounds really ridiculous, and yet that is becoming ideology. That's actually being taught in schools. Any of you got kids? I'm telling you now, they'll be learning that in school. It's funny now, but I'm going to come in a moment to the very ill effects of teaching them that sort of thing, which is as follows. Sorry, my memory is shocking these days. Because we've been given a sense of collective guilt in this way, we've been made to feel guilty about our colour of our skin, our civilization, our culture, everything that we did for Africa, everything that we did for India. Because we're compelled now to feel that it was all a bad thing, there's a natural corollary of that, which is that we have to do something to make up for it. We have to provide recompense to people for doing this. So in other words, when we look around now at the supposed effects of climate change, there's an expression that some of you might have heard of, climate refugees. Yeah. And this is where the whole business ties in with why we should supposedly accept unlimited numbers of immigrants. Because the story is now that having started the climate change, having started global warming, it's accelerating now, and a lot of people are having to leave Africa and Asia because of the change in the climate, and that it's only just and equitable that they should come here and take our country. And this is actually being stated explicitly. This isn't some fringe thing. This is a fairly mainstream idea. You've probably heard of climate reparations, which is another thing. So we've got to send them money to the third world, and we've got to accept the third world into this country as well. Because if we don't do that, it means we are heartless and unchristian and cruel and unfeeling. And an awful lot of young people honestly believe that now. They actually see how that is the state of affairs. It's a moral duty. This is what motivated people like Tony Blair. You know, I'm sure we all know the really extreme, quiet.
Traitor, Dark Lord.
It was, of course, Blair that started mass immigration. He turned the trickle into a flood. And there were several reasons. Obviously, everybody likes cheap labour, or you do if you've got a factory or something. If you're a businessman or a rich person, cheap labour's good because it means that you can have cheap builders for your extension. You can get a nanny cheaply. There's all sorts of great advantages. If you're a factory owner, cheap labour is terrific, or if you're a farmer. Blair, that was the strong business end to the immigration. But also, to be fair to Tony Blair and his cronies, they honestly believed that this was a duty that we had. They honestly thought that we should allow immigration, that it was wrong to deny people the chance to come here, for the reasons, the ideology which I've outlined here. So it's not just some harmless piece of nonsense that young people have. It's actually been a driver for making mass immigration seem to be a logical and a sensible and a moral thing to do. It doesn't really, it doesn't benefit people like us, ordinary people, because I haven't got a low fare and I don't own a factory or anything. So none of that cheap labour, all it really does, it lowers wages, and it means that English people lose out, they don't get jobs. I'm sure we can all remember a time when it was possible to get a job on a building site straight away. I don't know if people here have ever done this. When I was younger, I used to do a lot of labouring and work. It was the easiest thing in the world. If you didn't have any qualifications, you could turn up at a building site, get a job straight away. It's not possible now. Young English people that haven't got GCSEs or A-levels find it enormously hard to get work. And the reason is that there's loads and loads of foreigners that will work cheaper than they will. It's a pernicious ideology, and it's been subconsciously absorbed by all of us. And I want to talk now about one of the chief effects that we can see of it. That's the theory, as you might say. What are the practical effects? Right. We all know that the National Health Service is collapsing, I think, and sometimes we blame COVID for that, and sometimes we blame other things. There's really a very simple reason why the National Health Service is on its knees now. I said that it's an unwise thing when you're old to look back too much on the past and try and pretend things were better. But I'm sure that older people here will remember when things genuinely were better with the National Health Service. I'm sure they'll remember when you could just go turn up at the doctor's and be seen that day, just turn up and sit in the waiting room, and that was that. It sounds ridiculous now. I wouldn't have got to bothering telephoning the doctor. I'd just go down there in the morning, sit in the waiting room, and I'd be seen within an hour or so. It sounds like another world. Well, yeah, it does. It really does. I can remember too when casualty departments of hospitals, you went in there might be 2 or 3 people, you'd sit there, you'd be seen quickly, and whatever was wrong with you, the doctor would see you. Did anybody here use an A&E recently? Because it's like nothing on earth. I had occasion recently to go to King George's Hospital in Ilford with somebody, and A, there was a huge queue outside casualty there, and B, I couldn't help noticing that I was the only white English person in that queue. Every single person was either foreign or they were immigrants. And the reason is that a lot of those people haven't got GPs. They come here, they overstay their visa, and so rather than use the GP, they'll go to the casualty for the most trifling reasons. If their kid's got a cough, they'll go to casualty. They haven't got a GP, so they'll see the doctor at the hospital. That's something that happens right now. Anybody know East London at all?
Yeah.
Yeah? Right, anyone know Whipps Cross Hospital?
Yeah, my son was born there.
Great, okay. You know Whipps?
I do.
Great. 30 years ago, Whipps used to be a decent hospital, and it was perfectly good, it was perfectly adequate.
Yes.
It's absolutely not now.
I bet.
It is like nothing on earth.
It
It's
was
like
going downhill 36 years ago.
it's nothing at all compared with what it is now.
No.
And I just want to explain why. I know that some people listening to my channel, not the people here probably, I get a lot of abuse because they say that I'm always banging on about immigration. Well, there's a reason I always go on about immigration, because it really, really affects everything that we do. I don't know if anybody knows what the population of London is right now. It's over 9.5 million. Yeah, 30 years ago it was 6.8 million. So the population of London has increased by 50% in the last 30 years. But of course we haven't got 50% more hospitals. The hospitals that we've got are the ones that we had 30 years ago. They now have to cope with 50% more. They have to cope with 50% more people. And that makes the service that they provide absolutely atrocious. It's the same with other cities as well. Every city in England now, the population is increasing, but the facilities that are being used aren't increasing. So even in a city like Leicester has increased by 30% in the last 30 years as well. It means that every school, there's not more schools now really in London, not than there used to be, but the ones that are there are much, much more crowded. They're much more crowded also with children with difficulties, because a lot of people come to this country specifically because of their children. They come to the country because if a child's got complex needs and they're living in Sudan, they're not going to get much for those needs. They know that if they come to England, they'll get everything that they want, and it will be provided free. So I've paid into the National Health Service since I was 17, which is sort of many, many years ago. As things stand, in the last year, 500,000 people have arrived in this country. There's 500,000 people in Britain now more than was the case a year ago. And every single one of those 500,000 people is entitled to use all the facilities that we have. They're entitled to use the national health, they're entitled to use the schools, they use the transport, they use water, they use the sewage. All those services are absolutely crumbling away now. And it's all because of immigration. And the strange thing is that nobody will say this out loud. It's considered to be impolite. It's considered to be, well, not only racist, but it's considered to be sort of not the thing. If you mention even the word immigration, you probably notice that no one talks about immigrants these days. You have to talk about migrants. And the very word immigrant now has become almost an offensive expression. The newspapers won't talk about immigrants, let alone illegal immigrants. You have to talk about undocumented migrants. So the whole, even the language that we use has been changed to disguise what's going on. Thank you. just no, she's reflecting what I'm saying. Thank you.
Well done, TBG.
I hope that we'll see you at future TBG functions.